So thank you so much for joining this evening. We're going to be talking about Artemisia. So, wow, quite the image, quite the powerful image. Perhaps an image that's familiar to many of you. It's really sort of, I'd say it's probably Artemisia's most iconic work. It shows Judith beheading Holofernes, who was an Assyrian general. It's a story from the Old Testament, from the Apocrypha, and we'll come on to why she's doing that shortly. But firstly, let's just pick apart the painting as we always do in terms of colour and composition and form. So here we have, it's been described as a pinwheel, which I think is such a fantastic description of this composition when we look at it abstractly. We have this pinwheel, I suppose, of limbs, of arms and legs, which sort of is all focused on a central point, which is this very gory moment at the center of the composition where Holofernes' head is being severed from his body. We have three primary colors. We have red, blue and yellow that sort of are spread across this pinwheel, if you like, and sort of anchor the whole composition at that central point where there is no color, but that we're intended to be looking at that central point where we see Holofernes' torso, his upper body and his head being severed. It's all set against a very dark background, and it's lit incredibly dramatically. So all of this is sort of adding to the theatre of the moment. Holofernes, or the man, we should say at this point, is lying on this extraordinarily rendered three-tiered bed. We can see that the sheets are gathered at every individual layer, which are again beautifully executed in different tones of sort of white and grey. Without stating the obvious, the sheets are covered in drips of blood that are running through the furrows of the sheets and the undulations in the mattress. And we of course can see that these run in line with the sword that is pointing vertically and being held by this female figure on the right, and pulled through the neck of this unassuming male at the center of the composition. He is draped in this very luxurious red, sumptuous color with this sort of gold brocade edging, and of course this white sheet as well. But it seems that beneath these sheets he is completely nude. In the background, or at the center of the composition, we should say, is a lady dressed in blue, and she's wearing a turban or a headdress, very dramatically lit. You can see that half of her face is cast in shadow, and she's really focusing on the deed at hand. She's holding her hands down here at the center of his chest, trying to restrain him, to push him down, while her accomplice, or the protagonist, shall we say, is doing the gory act. So this figure in blue really is the accomplice. She's sort of the assistant to the figure in yellow, who has her sleeves rolled up. Her very elegant and refined yellow golden dress has been pushed. Both sleeves have been pushed right up to her upper arms, and it's enhanced by the fact she's wearing this very beautiful bracelet, this very detailed piece of jewelry, which is also being sort of pushed up halfway up her forearm, so as not to dirty any of her finery. And we can see through this little triangle, this little gap here at the center, that her right leg is actually hitched up onto the bed and is gaining purchase there, so that she really is sort of allowing herself to use her full tour de force to decapitate this very hairy, very awake and very alive male who is at the center of the composition, whose eyes stare quite disturbingly straight out at the viewer. As I said, there is a very dark background. There's a curtain on the right here, framing the composition, which is somewhat faded over time, I think probably due to a discoloration of the varnish in the painting. But all the action is right at the front, and that is where we want to be looking at. And as we say, we have this beautiful arc. If we really withdraw our gaze just to simple shapes and forms, we have this lovely arc that's being created by the three figures. Of course, these two women are sort of upright, and then the third male figure is very much on the bottom. He is very much being dominated upside down by these two very strong women. Have a look at the very strong parallel as well of her two forearms that is really drawing our attention down into that central point. And as I said earlier, with this pinwheel, we really have got a real dialogue between the different verticals and horizontals and diagonals of the different limbs and lines in the painting. For example, the arm of the maidservant, the accomplice, is echoed in the arm of the man, of Holofernes. And have a look at how Artemisia is really playing with scale here. The size of his fist is basically the same size as the head of the maidservant, so giving us a real sense of quite how big Holofernes is, and quite how much of a chore and an effort it is for these two women to overcome him. Probably the most disturbing moment of the painting is this blood that is spattering out here, this spurt of blood that is coming out of his neck. And the image that we've got here isn't too bad. You can see that there's a real Jackson Pollock effect going on her very elegant chest, her elegant dress, and onto her chest, also on the hands, on the skin of the two women. And we can see how she's painted this in a kind of dotted line to give the impression of the blood spurting, and us looking at this in a very, very specific moment. And we can see it running down here as well. So in terms of the sort of basic elements of painting, I think we've probably covered it. One other thing we haven't discussed perhaps is the facial expressions of the women. The lady in the middle in blue, who also has her sleeves rolled up, she is really, really focused on, she's looking down, she's focused on holding down this enormous brute. And Judith on the far right is looking with this very unusual expression, a kind of a resoluteness, a determination, but also she's sort of pulling her head away in somewhat in disgust, I think, as well, and surprise. But she's very much focused on the matter at hand. And as we said, he is looking quite surprised, quite shocked, very much awake, and staring right out at us. So it's an incredibly powerful image for all of the reasons stated, and it's very unusual because it's portraying the story of, as I say, Judith and Holofernes, this Old Testament story that was particularly popular among artists in the 17th century. However, Artemisia chooses to paint quite an unusual moment. This is her first ever treatment of the subject. She hasn't portrayed Judith and Holofernes before, and most artists at the time would paint this scene after the act. So often you see very dramatically lit scenes of Judith holding the severed head of Holofernes after she's decapitated him, and attempting to escape with his head with her maidservant. Whereas Artemisia has decided to dive into the moment where Judith is actually beheading him. Now, why is she beheading him? And why were they trying to escape? So Holofernes was, as I said earlier, he was an Assyrian general, and he was attempting to sack Judith's city. Judith was a Jewish widow, and she was from a city called Bethulia. And Holofernes was trying to sack it and destroy the people. And what Judith does, and she comes to be seen as a real heroine in the 17th century, a female hero, perhaps I should say. She dresses in her finery, which we can certainly see here. And she arrives in Holofernes' tent to dine with him and to win him over. And naturally, Holofernes probably drinks too much, probably becomes inebriated. He falls asleep, and she takes this opportunity to assassinate him, to behead him, and by extension to save her people. So she's seen as a real hero, and of course this is the moment that he has fallen asleep, and that she has unassumingly pounced on him and decapitated him. And this is the exact moment. I mean, you can see with the sword, it's not one way, it's not on the edge of his neck, and it's not through. It is literally in the middle of the act. And you can see how she is really pulling the sword through her neck. This is an incredibly realistic impression of someone actually pulling through dare I say, the tendons and the bones in someone's neck. You can see how the hilt of the sword is actually pushing into the arm of the upper arm of Holofernes there, and she's grabbing his hair with her left hand, his head with her left hand, and you can see how his hair is sort of coming through her fingers, giving us a sense of quite how much force she is using to sort of hold his head as she pulls the sword through his neck. So it's an incredibly active decision of Artemisia's to take to paint this particular moment. Now, this isn't in fact the first time Artemisia has painted this exact composition. So when I say her first treatment of the subject, the composition, similar composition to this, almost identical in fact, and I'm just going to switch screens so that I can use a comparative image. So this was the first version of this composition that Artemisia actually paints probably only a couple of years earlier. So this is a painting that she paints in Rome, and we'll talk through where this falls in the biography and life of Artemisia shortly. And you can see that it's very, very similar to what we've just been looking at. However, it's cropped, so we don't get the legs of Holofernes here. We have the same three-tiered bed. The sword here is a kind of condition issue. That's why it looks very faint, but similar dripping of blood over the sheets, and very similar composition with the arms of Judith and the maidservant sort of overhead. So you get this very similar pinwheel effect without the legs. Now, this painting itself was actually cut down, which is why the composition is thrown off here. We don't quite know how much by, but we know that Artemisia did use a tracing of this painting for the painting that we're looking at this evening. And we know that this one almost certainly came first because using sort of X-rays and X-radiography, we can see beneath the paint surface that there are a number of pentimenti, which are literally meaning, in Italian, literally meaning regrets. There are pentimenti which in painting means sort of previous marks. So she's been adjusting the composition in this first version, whereas in the second version, which we're looking at, the one with Judith in the yellow dress, she has very much painted the painting straight onto the canvas, and she's known exactly where she's going. And a tracing of this painting laid on top of the tracing of the Uffizi painting that we're looking at this evening shows that she did in fact trace the composition in order to get this very accurate second composition. So as I say, it's likely that she painted this in Rome, and then I'm just going to flick back to the second one. Well, I'll give it one more minute so you can continue having a look at this version. And it's thought that she then paints the second version only a year or two later, when she's in Florence. So you can see, as I say, the main differences here are the blue dress. This is actually a particularly bad reproduction. This is quite a vibrant blue, and you get this beautiful triangle of blue in between the arms of Holofernes and Judith here, which gives this sense of her leg being hitched up. And then, of course, the maidservant is actually beautifully rendered in this painting. And in fact, there are elements of this picture that I prefer. And often, you know, if you're doing anything for the first time, you often do it better. And then the second time you sort of try to recreate what you've been doing, but perhaps not quite so successfully. And this is a very beautiful painting, but due to firstly condition, but secondly, the fact it's been cut down, means that it's sort of the lesser famous perhaps of the two. So where I'm talking about them in coming in sequence, but where in her life did they come? So Artemisia was she was born in Rome. She's a Roman painter, but she had a fairly peripatetic existence. She sort of moved around mainly Italy, but she comes to England later on in her career as well. So we'll get to that point. However, this painting was sort of earlier on in her career. So she was born in Rome in 1593. And her biography is sort of best known really during these early years in Rome, into her late teens. She was born into a family she had three brothers. Her father was an artist called Orazio Gentileschi, who we've talked about on this series when we were looking at peace. We looked at his Rest on the Flight to Egypt. So her father was one of the leading painters really in Rome in the late 16th, early 17th century, and very much was painting in the circle of Caravaggio, Giovanni Baglioni, other artists, leading Baroque painters in Rome at the time. And he was incredibly successful. So she would have grown up in an artist's house, but she lost her mother when she was only 12. She lost her mother in 1605. So she was brought up in an incredibly male environment with these three younger brothers, no mother, and a father who was, by all accounts, quite a difficult and aggressive man. And really the sort of female duties, as it were, would have fallen on her. Being the only woman in the house, I say woman, the only sort of child, really. I mean, she was the only female in the house, but she was only 12 when her mother died. 2 years after her mother died, her aunt, her widowed aunt, came. Her aunt, who was a widow, came to look after them, and so she would have had a little more help. And it was during these years that she probably started to work with her father. So she would have started as a sort of studio assistant, grinding pigments, drawing from engravings, and perhaps learning from paintings that her father was creating. But she wasn't really gaining a sort of traditional training as her brothers might have. And her brothers, one of whom did become an artist, and they would have had a similar training to one another. They would have been able to roam the streets of Rome and go and copy after artists of the previous century, while Artemisia would have very much been required to sort of stay indoors and stay at home learning only from her father and of course from the churches that she would have visited. They had a very sort of unsettled first few years in her life in Rome. She moved house 7 times, so she was living in the city but moving from A to B to C. But her early existence was near Piazza del Popolo, which was the parish of Santa Maria del Popolo, in which there are 2 magnificent paintings by Caravaggio. So this was the church that her mother was buried in, and that she would have attended mass on a regular basis. So she would have had access to the paintings in there, and she would have seen Caravaggio's masterpieces. And we can see that this painting is very inspired by the kind of dramatic light of Caravaggio's paintings, not least by a painting that he paints of this exact scene, which I'll leave you to Google to avoid sharing my screen again, but you really can see and the inspiration, although Caravaggio's version of this painting, which of course comes earlier, is not quite so convincing, in that the figure of Judith is a much sort of weaker, perhaps more idealized, beautiful heroine who doesn't really look like she's giving it the welly that our Judith in this painting is. So Artemisia really gives Caravaggio's composition a kind of tour de force, as I said earlier, that isn't in existence in his painting. So she was growing up in a male environment. She was very much confined to home, but she did start painting very early on. Her first signed and dated painting is when she was just 16. It was signed in 1610. So she and around this time, her father Orazio writes to the Grand Duchess in Florence, telling her that Artemisia is incredibly talented and has been painting for a few years. So we know that she would have been painting independently, really sort of from the age of 13 or so. And the first painting that she does paint, or that's signed and dated, is incredibly accomplished, of Susanna and the Elders. So but it's around this time in 1611 that Artemisia, as many of you may know, was raped by an artist who was working with her father at the time. He literally sort of entered her house. I mean, there were artists and models coming and going all the time, and the house was very much a studio and a home. The sort of public places were private and the private places were public, and so he sort of entered the house, very much knew her father, and he forced himself upon her, and this is incredibly well documented, because of the trial that then ensues. Orazio, her father, presses charges against this artist. He's called Agostino Tassi, and there's an incredibly detailed trial document in the state archives in Rome that outlines exactly what happened from both parties, and you have a number of witnesses or testimonies that are given in the trial, which is why we know a lot about the incident, and of course about the living spaces, and about Artemisia in these early years, and the sort of various elements of her training. There's a huge amount of information in these documents that tells us not only about the act itself, but also about the context. Incredibly valuable document. So after a very, very difficult trial that goes on for months and months, and during which Artemisia herself is actually tortured in order to ensure that she's telling the truth, Tassi is eventually exiled from Rome for 5 years in November of 1612, which he doesn't actually complete. And he was a real wrong-un. He'd already been tried for incest in 1610. He'd tried to shoot a pregnant courtesan whom he was courting, later on as well. So he was not a good man. But the day after he had been sentenced, Orazio marries Artemisia to a man called Pier Antonio Stiattesi, who was the younger brother of the notary who had drawn up the prosecution for Orazio, so someone that had been involved in the trial. And the charges that were pressed were actually for deflowering Artemisia rather than for this sort of rape act. Rome was an incredibly dangerous city, incredibly rough, but Orazio was more ashamed. It's difficult to say. He was more ashamed for the family name, and he wanted to make sure that that Tassi was punished appropriately, given that he had tarnished the Gentileschi name by deflowering his daughter before she had been married. He had actually promised that he would marry her, but didn't, and that was the charge that was pressed against him. She was eventually married off, and then she goes up to Florence, and she stays with her husband Pier Antonio Stiattesi for some time. They live in her husband's her father-in-law's house as soon as they arrive in Florence, and she sets up a studio there. And between 1613, the year she arrives in Florence, and 1618, Artemisia has 5 children, only one of whom survives into adulthood. So during these years, and these are relevant to this evening's talk because these are the years in which she paints this painting, Artemisia was pregnant. She had 5 children in 5 years. So she's not only painting these phenomenal pictures, but she's also pregnant pretty much permanently. And she loses 3 of her children very young age. And then she loses her, she has 2 that she takes back to Rome. One of them dies at the age of 4.5, and the other, her daughter, sort of survives out survives Artemisia, so she lives into adulthood. So it's clearly a very traumatic, very difficult time for her. But all the while, this is really where Artemisia she's broken away from her father's shadow, and she's in Florence, and she's becoming an artist in her own right. And it's during this time that she uses her own image in order to publicize herself. She paints a number of self-portraits in different guises, and she's a PR machine. She signs her paintings, including this one, I don't think you can see in the reproduction, with her Tuscan surname, Artemisia Lomi. You can just see a signature down here. I don't know if we can make out the Lomi there, but her father, Orazio, was in fact from Pisa, but he moved to Rome when he was young and took his maternal uncle's name, Gentileschi, with whom he was living in Rome. And Artemisia employs her Tuscan surname when she's back up in Florence, so as to fit in. And it's in Florence that she really ingratiates herself with an incredibly sophisticated circle. She learns to read and write, and she starts working for the Medici, for Cosimo II, for his wife Maria Maddalena of Austria, and for his sister Santa Caterina, and for his sister Caterina de' Medici, which is why she paints, we think, a St. Catherine, which is the self-portrait in the National Gallery. A self-portrait as St. Catherine. Anyway, so she's up in Florence, and she's working for the Medici, and she's already painted this composition in Rome before she leaves. And we think that this is, as I say, the second version that she paints for Cosimo II de' Medici. And we think that for a number of reasons. The first is that we can see this very Florentine taste in the dress, this golden brocade fabric, very refined dress. The jewelry would have very much appealed to Florentine taste. The hair of Judith in this painting is much less disheveled than it is in the Roman picture. But it's also in Palazzo Pitti from a very early date. and it's transferred from there in the 1770s, I believe, into the Uffizi, where it currently resides today. And the Palazzo Pitti was, of course, the palace, the Florentine palace of the Medici family. And she paints a large number of paintings for the Medici. So the provenance of this picture is incredibly clean. It's very easy in that it's been in the Medici collection probably forever. And after success in Florence, she decides to return to Rome with her husband. She's in dire state financially, strangely, because she's had so many commissions. Her husband is quite a big spender, and they're constantly in debt. During her time in Florence, she becomes the first, rather significantly, the first female painter to enter the School of Design, the Accademia degli Arti. So it's the painting academy. She's the first female artist ever to become a member of the Accademia, which is a huge accolade in 1616. But in 1620, they returned to Rome in as I say, in dire financial circumstances. Her entire all of her possessions are in fact repossessed by the state, and she returns to Rome with her husband and eventually with her children, and then she has a period in Rome for 7 years, enjoying the time that she can really sort of work as an artist independently from her father, who's left by this point, and she becomes involved in a kind of community of foreign artists in Rome. And then in 1627, she goes to Venice for a few years. We don't quite know why she goes to Venice, but from Venice in 1630, a plague breaks out, and she goes down to Naples, where she spends the rest of her life, and she dies in 1654 probably from a plague that was ravaging the city of Naples. And it's in the late 1630s, so during this Neapolitan sojourn, that she goes to England and works for the court of King Charles I for a year, and she's joining her father, who's already gone there in 1626 to work for the king and queen, and she stays just for a year, leaving shortly after her father dies. Her brothers are all in England as well, and she returns to Naples. And it's in Naples that her style definitely shifts. She works with a large number of Neapolitan artists, and she works on a number of collaborative works, not only collaborative series, but also canvases as well. And her style very much shifts in this later period. So I think we've sort of covered most things. I'm aware I've talked a lot about her biography. I'd be interested to know if anyone has any strong feelings about the painting, any particular information they wanted to share about Artemisia, or intrigue about anything about her and her style or her life. I think what's probably relevant to conclude is that this painting is often seen in conjunction with the personal life of Artemisia, and I think it's a very difficult it's a very difficult aspect of her painting, that she had such a well-documented and sort of troubled life and career, personal life, and it's sort of complicated to align that with her incredible talent as an artist, because I think so many of these scenes that she paints, or particularly these scenes of Judith beheading Holofernes, or even her real focus on female heroes, on female figures, Old Testament figures largely, or women from mythology. So often she's seen as this sort of feminist hero. And this painting particularly is seen as a sort of vendetta painting, painted shortly after the rape, and the idea that this figure in the middle is is Tassie, who is documented as having a beard, and that this is her sort of revenge painting. There's certainly an argument in that. In the rape trial, it's in fact talked, there is it is stated that there was a tangle of knees, thighs, blood and knives. So it's certainly not far from that. However, Judith, the figure in this painting, is saving her people from an evil general. This is a triumphant act. This is not a vendetta painting as regards the story that it's depicting. But there perhaps is a biographical element to it, but I just don't know if it's as simplistic as this being Artemisia personifying herself as Judith, and beheading Tassie in revenge. But I can certainly see why those two things are aligned. And I think a large number of art historians are pulling away from the biographical narrative purely just to outline quite how talented she is as a painter, and not for her work to always be seen in conjunction with her life story. Thank you all for subscribing and joining. I'll be pausing everyone's subscriptions until you let me know that you want to join in on the next series. And have a wonderful evening, a very happy Easter, and I hope to see all of you very soon. Thank you so much.